Welcome to the next online class in Enlightened Consciousness, and the topic today is point 5 in the commonalities of the perennial philosophy worldview. If we follow the path to its conclusion, the result is rebirth or enlightenment, a direct experience of spirit within. Before we get going on to the content today, I just want to introduce the reflective writing exercise that I'm going to have you do at the end. And I want to introduce it here at the beginning so that you can start to have some kind of an idea of what you might write about. But today's topic is going to be all about death and resurrection, of old selves dying and new selves being reborn, and the process that we have to take to go through that. And so I'd like for you to reflect back on some kind of situation where you felt that you've been initiated into a new way of being, where there was an old you that has died, a new you that has arisen in its place. And you can ask yourself the questions that I have up there. Was it voluntary, involuntary? Because sometimes we take on these challenges willingly, and other times they happen to us. What did you lose and what did you gain? Did you have to sacrifice something? And then you can begin to sort of get an idea of that now, but then as we go through the class, I'd like you to connect it back with some of the language or the symbols or some of the characters that we're going to see and we're going to learn about. So this point 5 is a way of describing the destination, you might say, of the path, which was point 4. So this is what happens if we follow that path to its conclusion. This is the summit that we're going to attain and the view that we're going to see. So I want to say a few things in general about what that entails, and then we'll go and look at a few specific examples of this. So I think in general, this conclusion, this rebirth, this experience of spirit within, it's a state of consciousness where the you that you had previously identified with, the ego, is dead. And there's a new state of being, there's a new sense of self and identity that is reborn. So you're dead to your ego, but you're reborn in the spirit. Or to put it another way, your state of consciousness understands that that's what you really are, and that's what you've been all along. And so, amongst other things, that will entail the fixation, the obsession, the worry, the fear about the mortality of your body and your mental ego structure. That's gone. That you're no longer afraid of dying, just as a wave is not afraid of crashing into the shore because it understands that its essential energy is one with the ocean. And similarly, an enlightened person now understands that there is that eternal, immortal, deathless dimension of him or herself. And within that realization, there's also contained that while we're still alive, we have an innate nature, something that is our birthright, something that we're born with, that we don't have to generate, that is just as much a part of us as our fingers and toes. And that innate nature is one of enlightenment, is Buddha nature. And we hadn't seen it before. So the you that had identified with ourselves as the ego was preventing us from seeing that. And now that's gone and we can fully see it. And we begin to live our lives out of that instead of living out of ego-based motivations. That will result in compassion, which is the 7th point of commonality, which we'll discuss in the future. But one thing to keep in mind here is that this is a big if. If we follow the path to its conclusion, it is by no means a given that everyone who embarks on this path and this quest to find your true nature will succeed. There's going to be a lot of temptations along the way. And just keep in mind here some of these phrases and images that we've studied in the previous classes. The idea that the path to enlightenment is a razor's edge. It is that thin. There is zero margin for error. That there's a million ways to get it wrong and only one way to get it right. And that's echoed in Jesus' sentiment, great is the gate, but narrow is the way. And so we'll see exactly why that's the case. So a good place to start thinking about this would be to go back to Joseph Campbell's notion of the hero journey, this archetype that we spoke about several classes ago. And remember that the hero's journey is a pattern that recurs in many different cultures at many different times in different figures' journey towards awakening or enlightenment. Everything from Harry Potter and the Matrix all the way back to Moses and Jesus and the Buddha. And so Joseph Campbell distilled all of these elements that those journeys had in common. And so the important thing to note for our purposes here is that if we've made it this far, in the sense that we sense that there is a path that needs to be followed towards something higher, towards liberation or enlightenment, then there's been something that's called us that way. You notice the figure at the top, that's where the hero's journey starts. It always starts with a call to adventure. And as I was saying before, sometimes this is voluntary, sometimes you go out and choose it, and other times it chooses you. And so you have to leave the known. If you want to be transformed, if you want to be reborn, if you want to understand enlightenment and the nature of spirit within, the first thing you have to do is to leave behind everything that you thought you knew about yourself. And this oftentimes involves leaving behind people and structures that reinforce that false sense of self. And many of us have experienced this in ways that maybe we wouldn't necessarily articulate in a spiritual sense. But anytime you found yourself in a situation or a family dynamic where it's felt too constrictive, where it's felt that if you just stay there, you're going to be dead inside, where there's something or someone more that you need to be and that you need to leave that environment in order to do so. Anytime that has happened to you, then you've embarked on that hero's journey. And it's very frightening because it's more comfortable, it's more familiar to stay around in the known world. But sometimes we have to leave that. We have to go beyond the threshold of what we know about ourselves and down into the unknown. And in that journey, as you can see on the chart there, we've probably gotten some help from mentors, from teachers, from helpers, from books, from experiences that have helped us along this way and have nurtured us and have sort of encouraged us to go a little bit deeper and deeper. And we've probably faced some preliminary challenges. We've probably been tempted to go back home, maybe when the things are getting a little bit too challenging. But as you see at the very bottom of that diagram, the biggest challenge, the abyss, the revelation that comes along with confronting the abyss, that's the biggest challenge. And there are also the biggest rewards that are still there. So what is that exactly? So following this path away from the known, away from whatever is constricting us, will lead us into a place of the absolute unknown, and that is often described as the abyss. And what do you find? What do you confront in the abyss? This is the place that is within you that is the most unknown and therefore the most scary. And so sometimes we might have a conscious sense of what we're afraid of, but most of the time, this place that is within us is a place that we don't even know is within us, that it's something that we can't even think about, that we can't bear to even consider, that there is something that is potentially so dangerous and so powerful that is lurking within us that we will need to confront and that we will need to integrate if we're going to be successful and arrive at the destination of this journey. And so sometimes it can be a person, sometimes a relationship that we might have with somebody. It might be a situation. It can take different forms for different people. And so in mythology, it's often symbolized by water or wells or sea creatures, and those all kind of share the characteristics that there's some power that is mysterious and lurking and that might jump out at you at any time. And so with our descent into the abyss, we're going to be tempted there. We're going to want to run away. Part of the abyss and that part of us might lead us into unhealthy ways of being. And so we'd be tempted to take those up because they're more known. And so within that temptation, there's a great danger there. You might get destroyed. You might not be successful with your confrontation with the dragon or with the sea creature. But if you are successful, there's the greatest potential for transformation and for transmutation, for taking something that is within you and changing its shape. And so this is, if you know anything about the medieval practice of alchemy, alchemy was a process where people tried to turn lead into gold, a useless, not very valuable metal into the most precious metal possible. And so that is all a metaphor for this inner process of transformation, where in the place of the abyss we find something that oftentimes is not very pleasant to see, but if we work with it in the right way, then it can become a true treasure. And so you see the quote from Jung out there that actually, for those of us who don't do that, and it's most of us most of the time, those very same energies and those very same forces are going to manifest outwardly, and we're going to call them fate. So what exactly is this abyss? Is this place within us that is so terrifying but also so potentially powerful? I want to look in detail at the temptation stories of Buddha and Jesus, and we're going to see that there are a great many similarities, and they're very instructive for anybody who is undergoing this process of inner transformation, that these are the sorts of things that one is going to dig up in those very deep parts of oneself. So just a few prefatory remarks before we go and talk about some of the details here. When we're going to read about and discuss the three temptations of each figure, is this a historical event that happened? Were there eyewitnesses that can confirm and corroborate this account? No, I would say that maybe is not the right way of looking at these stories. That would be a logos way of looking at things, but the real meaning of these stories has to be seen on the mythos level. So just a short background of the Buddha specifically. I had mentioned in an earlier class that the Buddha actually, he was a prince before. His name was Siddhartha, and that he had left his palace and gone on a quest for enlightenment and had studied for 6 years with various teachers in India at the time. And he abandoned those teachers because he realized that they were not able to lead him to the place where he was looking. And so he adopted a new approach, which he called the middle way, and he sat under a tree called the Bodhi tree, and he resolved not to move until he became enlightened. And it's at this point, just before he becomes enlightenment, that he is attacked or assailed by a figure called Mara. And Mara in Sanskrit means the tempter. And so it's kind of like a Buddhist version of the devil, except that in Buddhism, they understand that Mara is not an external force to you, that Mara is within you. And so Mara tries to dislodge Siddhartha as he's about to become enlightenment. He throws a number of things in Siddhartha's path to try to deter him or to get him off of that road to enlightenment. And we're going to see what each three of those are in just a second. But the important thing, and the mythos way of looking at this, is that what we're about to study, these are all representative of the obstacles that anybody who is seeking their true nature will face. And so when we look at the Buddha's temptations and we look at Jesus's temptations, it's really important to understand that these temptations to varying extents are within you. That this is not something particular, individual, unique to these two figures, but these are the types of things that human beings who are going down this path to enlightenment tend to encounter. And there's a great quote from a Sri Lankan monk that when we look at these temptation stories, all of these temptations are personifications of forces antagonistic to enlightenment. So they're giving shape, they're giving some color and some form to the various inner challenges that we're going to face as we go down the road to enlightenment. So Siddhartha is sitting there under the Bodhi tree. There's about to be some kind of breakthrough or enlightenment happening, but then Mara puts him to the test, so to speak, and throws 3 temptations his way. And if you look at this image, it's quite remarkable because you actually see all of the temptations there, and we'll focus on them one at a time. The first temptation that the Buddha is described to have been sort of assailed by is physical desire. So Mara sends his daughters to seduce the Buddha. And you can see the figures that are kind of scantily clad there in the drawing. And so, one thing to keep in mind is that this was a story that came into prominence and was developed after the Buddha died, most likely, and that it was passed on from monks to other monks, and most monks at the time were male, even though the Buddha did allow for nuns in his sangha, in his community. And so it's very interesting that they would describe that this was the first temptation that the Buddha faced. It was sexual desire. This is something that probably a lot of people in that community had to deal with. And it's certainly something that many people, both male and female, tend to deal with on a regular basis. It's very easy to become distracted from what's truly important in life by the pursuit of sexual pleasure or sexual partners. That might not always be the most wise course of action. We can do a lot of stupid things when we're horny. So the Siddhartha is sitting there. Mara sends these beautiful dancing daughters his way, and Siddhartha is unmoved. He does not take the bait, so to speak. He doesn't reach after and lust for these beautiful women that are tempting him into all sorts of sexual pleasures with them. So Mara sees that fails, and he moves on to other temptations. The second temptation that's thrown Siddhartha's way is fear. And this is personified, it's symbolized in the form of armies of vicious demons. And you can see them in the image here too. There's one on the top right that has an arrow, and there's one on the left that looks like he's about to bring down a sword. And so Mara says, well, if I can't get you to move through tempting you by desire, then maybe I can threaten you, and then maybe I can see if I can get you to move through fear. And so again, was it actually the case that there were some armies of demons running towards Siddhartha as he was sitting under the tree? No. When you sit in meditation with yourself, and when you really engage in the process of self-inquiry, you're going to find things within you that frighten you, that scare you, things that maybe you don't want to admit to yourself about yourself. And how are you going to deal with them? Are you going to get up off the meditation cushion and run away into some distraction? Are you going to go back to a place, a relationship that you had to leave, that you sense was unhealthy for you, just because you would rather have something known rather than confront this unknown and this potentially scary aspect of yourself? Siddhartha sees these demons coming at him, sees these things that are coming up in himself that are very frightening and very scary, and he remains unmoved. He doesn't give up his seat. He doesn't react out of the ego-based emotion of fear. So Mara has to take it one step further and tries to dislodge him with another temptation. So Mara pulls out all the stops, and his final attempt at getting Siddhartha to move is by tempting him through what you might say is social duty. So remember that the Buddha, or Siddhartha before he becomes the Buddha, was a prince. He left his family in his palace. He had a wife and a young son who he basically abandoned to go on this quest for enlightenment. He ran away from his father and from all of the people in the kingdom that were expecting him to be the next king and to take the role of his father. And so Mara kind of says to him, well, who really are you to sit here? Did you ever think about your wife and your family and what they must be going through in these 6 years since you've been gone, since you abandoned them? Your father must be really disappointed in you. Your wife must hate you. And if you come from maybe a Jewish or a Greek or an Italian background or some other cultures, you might be familiar with this way of thinking, that sometimes mothers and also fathers in those cultures can kind of guilt trip you into saying, well, if you were a good son, then you wouldn't do this to disappoint me. Who are you to be acting out this way? And so Mara in the story says, who gives you the authority to be here? Did you check with your father to make sure that this was going to be okay? And so Siddhartha at that point says, okay, actually he doesn't say anything. He reaches down, he touches the ground, he touches the earth. He says, the earth is my witness. The earth gives me the authority to be on this journey. And it's at that point that he has this final breakthrough and he becomes enlightened, and all of the various temptations fall away. And he has broken through. He has followed the path to its conclusion. He's gone into the abyss of himself, confronted these 3 very challenging things that we all have in us to a varying extent, and he has overcome them. So we'll take a short little break here with a little video from a scene out of a movie called Little Buddha. And this is the scene where Siddhartha becomes enlightened. So it goes through all the temptations that we just studied, but it does it in a way that's very well done. It's personified, and you can really see it come to life. And don't ask me why they chose to cast Keanu Reeves as the Buddha. I've been pondering that one for a while, and honestly, I still don't know. But overall, it's like I said, it's well done. So go ahead and have a look, and when you're done, come on back to the presentation. So I hope you enjoyed that, and if you've ever seen The Matrix, you'll know that actually there's a very similar scene at the end of The Matrix with also Keanu Reeves, where he, when he realizes his true nature as Neo, he has also a very similar process of going through challenges of being shot at and chased, and then he's able to overcome that and to literally be reborn in that film, which I would suggest you have a look at if you haven't already. So just to summarize, I want to really emphasize this point once again, that these temptations, they're not just a one-time thing for this one person at this one place in time. These are challenges that anybody on the path of enlightenment will face. You're going to be tempted to, take an easier way of living out than to sit on your meditation cushion and be very diligent with your ethical practice. It's a lot easier to sit around and play video games and have a beer and indulge in activities that are just momentarily satisfying than it is to look for your true nature. And it also, you're going to deal with opposition from friends, from family, from lovers, and this is what all these images are trying to convey to us, that if you do encounter those things that are trying to move you, you sit still, you see through them, you don't give in to them, you don't allow them to take you off of the path. And if you don't allow them to take you off the path and you're diligent and you stick to this path, then the reward that you're going to find on the other end will make it more than worthwhile. Very interesting detail here that we're going to see has a parallel in the Christian tradition in a moment. In the Buddhist literature about Mara, they say that Mara continued to visit the Buddha after he became enlightened. So it's not like Buddha conquered Mara at this moment of enlightenment and then was done with Mara once and for all. That Mara kept recurring and coming back to him again and again and again to again see if he could tempt the Buddha out of that enlightenment. But because the Buddha had become so firmly established in enlightenment, then those temptations were not tempting, that they weren't as challenging as this original moment of breaking through into this Buddha consciousness. So this should be very interesting for many of us to reflect on, that, once you overcome a temptation one time, that doesn't mean that you're not going to be tempted by it again and again and again, repeatedly into the future. So I want to take the next couple slides and actually develop this point just a little bit more, because I think it's so interesting and it's so important, and I want to give you a couple examples of how this plays out in real life. So to get there, I just thought it would be good to ponder the question, well, what does it exactly mean to overcome the temptation? Or what do they mean when they say that the Buddha was unmoved by Mara's temptations? And an interesting place to start thinking about that is to reflect in the Tibetan language that the word Buddha, which in Sanskrit means awakened, in Tibetan it can be translated as he who knows what to accept and what to reject. And so when we talk about Buddha nature, which, don't forget, you have Buddha nature in this very moment right now. It is your innate nature. You don't see it most of the time because you're caught up in the ego activities, but it is there, hidden within you, like the light of a lamp that's been covered over by dust. So there's a part of you that is equipped to be able to discern the types of things that you should nourish and the other types of things that maybe you should set aside. And so if you've ever had an experience with your own conscience, you've probably come in contact with this, that there's that part of you that says, I better not do that. Well, that's that Buddha nature saying, okay, reject that temptation to, whatever it is, go to a party with people that you know that you shouldn't go to, or reject that part of your mind that just wants to retaliate against somebody for saying some offensive thing to you. We've all had experiences with that, so it's something that is very much more real than maybe you think it is. So I want to just go through each of the three temptations again and examine them in this light. And if you feel like you've got a good grasp on this whole temptation thing, then you can skip over the next couple slides, but I think it would be interesting for most of you to go and have a little bit more context of what these temptations are and how they relate to you. So let's start with the first temptation about desire, sexual temptation. It's a good question to ask, well, why should we set that aside? Why should we reject that? Why should we remain unmoved? Or why did the Buddha need to do that in order to break through to enlightenment? And so this question that I'm putting up there, well, what's the best that can happen in a sexual encounter? If you ask yourself that question, then you are actually activating that Buddha nature part of yourself. You're able to step back and to see the situation in a larger context and not just caught up in your own particular ego desire. Because for most of us, the ego desire when it comes to sex is, let's go and get some, as much as we can, as many people as we can, etc., etc. And so if there is that part of you, and probably most of us have encountered this, at least when it comes to sex, that says, I might be tempted to go with this person, or I might be tempted to indulge my sexual energy in ways that might not be healthy for me. If you're asking yourself that question, then you're seeing the sexual act in a larger context. And maybe if you act on that wisdom, then in that moment, you've overcome that temptation. Again, it doesn't mean that in the very next moment you won't be tempted again. That just because you say no to sex with somebody who you shouldn't one time, the offer might come up again the next day or the next week, or maybe you're feeling particularly vulnerable in the future and it comes up again. And so if you really reflect back on, sex and what it can do for you, it really just at the end, it produces a fleeting moment of ecstatic pleasure. It is very pleasurable for most people, and that's why most people tend to chase after it. And so, that's the end goal which we're seeking in a sexual encounter. But to get to that point, a lot of bad things can happen, which we've discussed in previous slides in thinking about sexual misconduct. A lot of people use sex to bolster their ego, to sort of set themselves up and to sort of remain proud of themselves about various conquests or seductions. And so it really ultimately just ends up reinforcing the idea of separate self. And again, there's a caveat here that if it's used in the context of a loving relationship, then the results might be different. But at least as it's described here in Mara's Temptations, it's really just about the physical desire, the lust for sex. And, if I am just honest with you about my own consciousness and my own self, this is something that I, like many men, deal with repeatedly on a daily basis. And sometimes there are sexual thoughts or sexual ideas that just arise in my consciousness, as they do in many people's consciousness. And so there's a part of me that says, well, okay, if I really indulge in that and I really follow that, then that's going to lead me down a road that's only going to bring suffering to myself and others. And I might have a moment where those desires or those thoughts kind of die down. But again, that doesn't stop them from coming up in the next moment. So it's interesting to think of it in that context, because sometimes we might think about becoming a Buddha as attaining a permanent state. And for some people, like the historical Buddha, it was a permanent state. But for most of us, we get just glimpses of it from time to time, from moment to moment, where there is this deeper wisdom that is arising. And when we're acting on that deeper wisdom, then we are acting our Buddha nature. So if we reflect on the next temptation, fear, why should that be set aside? Why should we seek to remain unmoved if we're pursuing the path to enlightenment? Very interesting. I'll just point out this image on the top there of the Buddha kind of being protected by a hand of serpent heads. This is an image that comes up in many different cultures of the enlightened or the awakened one having control of snakes. And being protected by snakes. And this is a huge discussion, which we can talk about in class if you'd like. But in general, that's referring to what is called the Kundalini energy. And there's complicated explanation of what this is, but basically, in the Indian system of thinking, there are different energy centers in your body that go from the base of your sacrum all the way up to the crown of your head, and one has to, as it were, control or not be taken in by the tendencies or the inclinations of the lower chakras, which are associated with food and with sex, and that when one is able to overcome those, then it opens up access to higher levels of consciousness, which are symbolically represented in the body, in the heart center, and in the third eye, and on the crown of one's head. So I point this out because in some of the descriptions of Buddha's enlightenment, it's actually a snake that comes up to protect him from all of the arrows and the attacks of Mara's army. In any case, fear, we have to realize, is a fundamentally ego-based emotion. It's a worry about me, about my existence, what might happen to me. Oftentimes, we might not even realize that we're being driven by fear, that it's unconscious. And I put up a couple examples of fears, and without going into too many details, those are all fears that I have encountered within myself as I've sat in meditation and pursued this spiritual path. And what I've discovered, like many other people, is that when you run away from those fears and you don't confront them and you don't recognize them, then we end up taking on unhealthy patterns that actually don't deal with the root causes of what we're running from. And by contrast, when we're able to be unmoved by fear, or when we're able to welcome fear or to smile at fear, we realize, well, first of all, it's an impermanent emotion. It's not going to last forever. It comes and goes. And then if we really sit with it and meditate with it, then it can open us up to discover things about ourselves that we didn't know that we had. We can discover capacities that we didn't think that we had. And in this sense, when you actually sit with the fear and you see that it doesn't have to be all defining, that you can persevere through situations that you thought were impossible, then there's a tremendous weight that is taken off your shoulder. You're not afraid of going through life in that way anymore. And in that sense, it's very liberating. It gives one a sense of true freedom, that anything is possible. And so I think for all those reasons and a lot more, that's why here in the temptation stories, this is such one of the big ones, is that we encounter it so frequently in our experience that we might not even realize how we're actually being driven by it. And the Buddha sits still, and when you encounter a fear and you sit still and you don't get paralyzed by it, you don't allow that fear to define yourself, then you are activating your Buddha nature in that moment. And remember, again, just because you overcome it once doesn't mean that it is overcome for good. Although if you do practice overcoming specific fears, eventually that can be integrated into yourself, like you're no longer afraid of heights. But for most of the other fears, especially the ones that I have listed up there, it's more of a continual process, and it's a work in process, let's just say. Finally, the third temptation, and then we'll be moving into the Jesus temptation story for a reason you'll see in just a second. The social obligation. Why should we set that aside? Why do we need to be unmoved by it? If we reflect a little bit and ask ourselves the questions, well, do our parents actually know what is good for us? Have we absorbed unconsciously maybe some of their worldview and maybe their prejudice and their beliefs about who we are and what we should do with our lives? All that is part of the ego structure. And if we just blindly obey what our parents tell us to do, then we're actually leading the life that they want for us. And it might not be the life that we need to lead. And maybe you've encountered this already, where your parents or your family tells you that you should go a certain way, and there's part of you that just reacts violently against that and says, no, I can't do that. To do that, I would be having to sacrifice what's most essential about myself. And if you're strong, you'll listen to yourself and you'll be able to move past that. But in most cases, we end up bowing to the pressures that our parents and our society puts on us, especially in terms of marriage. There are a lot of cultures where, if you try to marry somebody that's outside of the culture or outside of the religion, your parents might even disown you. And that can be very challenging for people that they love somebody and they don't understand why, for example, they're not allowed to marry somebody who's not Italian or not Jewish or not Greek or whatever it happens to be. And that can create a lot of discord within families. I have a quote up there from Jung about how nothing has a greater influence on the child than the unlived life of the parent. And so very often the ways in which our parents try to control us, it's making up for something, a lack that they had when they were growing up and that they hadn't actually dealt with. And so I have this quote from the Gospel of Luke here, where Jesus seems to be indicating precisely the same thing. And he says it in even stronger language, that in order to become his disciple, you have to hate your father and mother, your wife and your children, your brothers and sisters. And very interesting, your own life, your own ego, your small s self. Those are the conditions to become a disciple of Jesus. And I think it's for the same fundamental reason that the Buddha had to overcome his temptation of social obligation too, that he was being held back by the thought of, okay, is what I'm doing right? Is it pleasing to my parents? Is it pleasing to my wife? You've got to break through all of that can all be reinforcement and re-strengthening of the ego structure. And to get through to the true nature of consciousness, those elements might very well be obstacles. And again, just to reiterate the point, you might be able to do it once, but that's no guarantee that that's a once and for all type of thing. So let's turn our attention now to the specific temptations that Jesus faced, because they can be illuminating in other ways. So let's turn our attention now to the Jesus temptation stories. And just as a sort of point of information, that these are stories that are recounted in 3 of the 4 canonical Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And as you're going to see, there's a great many commonalities between the Buddha and Jesus temptation stories. On a basic level, they each faced 3 temptations. For both of them, these temptations happened outside of urban environments. In the Buddha's case, underneath the Bodhi tree. In Jesus's case, in a desert environment, in a wilderness. And both of these temptation events happened after a very long period of searching and fasting. So it's not like they just went out into the forest or went out into the desert and boom, were immediately tempted. In Jesus's case, it comes at the end of a 40-day period of fasting and prayer. In the Buddha's case, after 6 years of practicing various forms of yoga. And each person, Buddha and Jesus, had been initiated into the deepest wisdom that their culture had to offer at the time. In the Buddha's case, it was those yoga teachers that he studied with. In Jesus's case, it was John the Baptist. And both Jesus and Buddha found that those instructions were helpful, but that they could go beyond it, that they needed to go beyond it. And so there are some differences about the specific temptations that Jesus faced. They're not exactly the same that the Buddha faced, but it doesn't mean that they're contradictory. And actually, when we study the differences, it's very instructive, because when we take the Buddha and the Jesus story together, then we get a more complete picture of the type of inner obstacles that everyone faces when trying to discover their true nature and trying to break through into this enlightened realization, this rebirth. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of those details. So before we look exactly at the 3 temptations specifically, it might be a good idea to ask who in this story is doing the tempting. And in the Christian tradition, it's identified as Satan or the devil. But also in the Bible, he's referred to as the deceiver. So you can probably sense some overlap with Mara, because that's what the word Mara also means. And so in the Christian tradition, just like in the Buddhist tradition, this figure is depicted as an external figure who comes to Jesus and tempts him with something. But again, I'm going to encourage you to look at this symbolically, as there's an element in yourself that has the tendency of pulling you away from the path that you know is true, and from deceiving you into thinking that something is good for you when actually it's not. So just one other brief note is that if you were around at the time of Jesus and you were talking about temptation, well, then anybody in the Jewish community at that time would have been familiar with this previous temptation of Adam and Eve, like we saw a few classes ago in Genesis. So there's some resonance backward in the tradition, making reference to earlier figures, and the entire history of Christianity and the evolution of its thought and its rituals. You really can't understand it outside of the Jewish context, because there's all these references that you begin to discover once you open your eyes to them. In any case, so the first temptation that Jesus faces, he's out in the desert after having met John the Baptist. He's fasting. Satan comes and tempts him by giving him the opportunity to turn stones into bread in order to relieve his hunger. And so in some way, I think you can look at this symbolically as being a larger point for physical desires in general. And so in that sense, there's some connection with the Buddha's temptation about physical desires. You could also probably see that there's some fear that would be mixed in this temptation, that Jesus is fasting. There's maybe the possibility in his mind that he thinks he's going to be too weak to continue on living. So maybe there's this fear of not surviving. And so Satan here is saying, okay, well, all of that can be put aside if you just would turn these stones into bread. Come on, you can do it. And Jesus' response, man does not live by bread alone. And wow, is that ever a powerful statement there? He's indicating that, yes, it's true that as human beings, we have material needs and we need to address them and take care of them and nourish them. But that is not the only dimension of needs that human beings have. And in fact, what you might call emotional or spiritual needs are probably more important than physical needs. And so if you look at bread as a metaphor for survival and subsistence, you can really see this nowadays with people who are very wealthy, who have millions of dollars, but that are unfulfilled inside or unhappy. They have all the bread, symbolically, metaphorically, that they could ever want. And yet there's something that's still lacking. And so Jesus' response there really points to that you have to take care of yourself physically, but do not neglect these other dimensions. So he overcomes this temptation by not giving into it, by realizing that he was on sort of a higher mission, as it were, and that he needn't be afraid of the potential consequences of his fast, that he's out there in the desert, he's fasting, he's connecting with himself, he's seeking God, and that is what is more important. So after Jesus has remained unmoved by the temptation of relieving his hunger by turning stones into bread, he has rejected that. Satan brings another temptation forward, and this is where we diverge a little bit from the Buddhist tradition, that the second temptation in the Christian tradition is the temptation towards spiritual power. And this is not to say that the Buddha wouldn't have faced this very same temptation himself in his life and his journey. It just doesn't get as expressed explicitly in the Buddhist tradition. But as I've said many times, these temptations, they will occur to everybody who is on a quest to find their true selves. And so the way that this is expressed is that Satan takes Jesus atop a temple in the holy city, which is Jerusalem, and he says to Jesus, you can leap and the angels are going to catch you. And so the implication here would be that there would be a crowd that would see that, they would be impressed with Jesus's powers, and they would follow him because they also want to have some kind of miraculous intervention on his part. And so Jesus says, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. It kind of echoes what I was saying last slide about how there's so much in the Jewish tradition that Jesus draws on. Jesus, of course, was a Jew, as were all of his early followers, and this is a quote taken directly out of the book of Deuteronomy. And so the point here really is that Jesus is resisting being a show-off, as it were. That if he's going to offer any teaching to other people around him, he doesn't want it to come from the place of people being so impressed and awestruck by him that they're going to beseech him for favors and rewards that he might be able to offer. That his purpose and his ministry was about something much more than that. It was about opening up people to see the kingdom of God within themselves and the kingdom of God around them that they haven't been able to perceive. And so if he accumulated a group of followers like this, then that message probably wouldn't have gotten through. And it also would have tempted him to become quite egotistical with his powers as well. And you see this in spiritual communities of people who have gifts of healing or other sort of spiritual powers, you might say, that they can become extremely inflated with their ego and think that they are special and lose sight of the fact that actually that gift is coming from something or some place beyond themselves. So Jesus was able to see through that, remain unmoved, and Satan tries one last thing. And that last temptation is political power. And again, this is something that's not explicitly mentioned in the Buddhist tradition. And in the Christian tradition, Satan takes Jesus atop a mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world and basically says, look, if you'll bow down and swear your allegiance to me, then I can make make it happen, that you will have all the political and military power that you could ever dream for over all of the kingdoms of the world. And so to understand why this would be such a temptation, you have to understand just a little bit about how Jews at the time were under Roman rule, and that there was a very long tradition in Judaism thinking about a figure called Messiah, the Savior, who would come and deliver Jews from their enslavement and their subjugation. And so many people thought that Jesus was the Messiah. They thought that he was going to be the one to lead a revolution and to overthrow the Roman Empire and establish a properly Jewish state in Israel. And so Satan's saying, look, I can make that possible. I can help you to get those Romans out of here. And imagine the accolades that Jesus would have had for that. He would have been venerated. He would have become an emperor himself, probably. And so his response, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. So he's saying, I'm not going to serve you. I'm not going to give you any of my power. It's not important political power in this world. What's truly important is the extent to which one has looked within oneself and recognized the kingdom of God. And you can do that in a terrible situation. You can do that in a situation where your people are humiliated and exploited. That, as it were, that historical backdrop doesn't matter very much to the inner work, which should be more important. And you see this play out, especially in early Christian history, that you have many people coming to a Christ-like realization, or a realization of their Christ consciousness, and they're doing it in horrendous situations of horrible persecution and death and martyrdom. So Jesus is able to reject this temptation. And very interesting, we see another parallel with the Buddhist tradition, in that it's explicitly mentioned that when the devil had finished all of this tempting, the devil left Jesus until another opportune time. And so you see, this is the same message that's communicated with that little detail added in the Buddhist tradition, that Mara continued to visit the Buddha after his enlightenment. And I think the point here is exactly the same as I've tried to convey many times in this class, that just because you overcome these temptations once or twice or even 3 times, it doesn't mean that you're immune from them for the rest of your life. Even beings as great as Jesus and Buddha still had to struggle against these deceptions and these temptations, but they were so firmly established in this new reborn consciousness that they were able to overcome those temptations. And so after these 3 temptations, this is the beginning of Jesus' very short ministry, only lasted a few years before he was crucified. But like the Buddha, after these 3 temptations, there's some kind of breakthrough in consciousness, and then he goes out and he's able to offer that to the community. So now we're arriving at the end of this class, and I just wanted to provide a little summary about this idea of death and resurrection and bring it back to what we were talking about before in terms of the hero's journey. So just to summarize, if you can break through all of those temptations that we just went through in the Jesus and the Buddha stories, remembering that these are moment-to-moment temptations, it's not a once-and-done type thing, then you could describe this as the animal part of you, the ego part of you, dies, and reborn in its place is a new consciousness, a new awareness that everything is spirit or a Buddha nature. And so when you think back to what I had asked you at the outset of the class for the reflective writing to consider, has there really been a time in your life where that has happened, where you've made a decision to become a new type of person and that you've had to leave something behind? And, was that a voluntary or involuntary affair? Can you relate to this language and this symbolism with your own personal life? And so the old you is dead. The old identity of being a limited mortal ego is gone, and a new one has risen to take its place. And we'll see with the deeper dive group the symbolism of the resurrection. And so one way of looking at this is that you've had to sacrifice yourself, the small s self, in order to gain yourself, the capital S self. And just to be clear, this journey is expressed in numerous different ways, countless different ways in different mythologies. And I have a few examples from the biblical traditions there of Jonah and Daniel. But if you look into the medieval Arthurian legends, anytime there's a dragon or a demon, that's also symbolic of overcoming temptations. If you're familiar with Greek mythology, Theseus and the Minotaur, Theseus has to kill this beast that is at the center of a labyrinth, and the labyrinth is symbolic of entering into oneself, and at the center one finds what is most terrifying and what is most tempting to give into, and all of these heroes find their way through it. They thread the needle, and they're able to survive that journey, and that is why it's such a profound archetype. And so this moment where you confront the demon, the dragon, the devil, the minotaur, the beast, whatever it is, that unconsciousness that is in you that you didn't realize that was there, if you can make it through that, then as I was saying earlier, that's the greatest danger, but it also offers the greatest potential for reward. And you begin this journey outward. Notice on that hero's journey that the abyss, that's only halfway through. That going to the center of the labyrinth, you're only halfway done. Now you've got to make your way back out. Now, after having overcome these temptations, you've undergone this transformation, and you begin to understand how you might be able to communicate this message with others. So that's exactly what the Buddha did. That's exactly what Jesus did. That's exactly what all of these great historical heroes have done, that they don't go on these journeys purely for their own benefit, but they do it in order to be able to share some insight, some new way of being with the community that they have left behind. So we're going to look in the next couple classes more specifically about how that is done. So I just have another short reflective writing exercise to conclude this class. You can read the instructions up there. Maybe it has occurred to you already to think about what it is that most tempts you. And I'm talking about this, of course, in the sense of something that pulls you away from your center, from your better judgment. And if you can give me a specific example, that would be great. But if you don't want to disclose specific details about your inner struggle or personal life, that's fine. You can talk about it in general terms. And another way of looking at this would be to ask yourself, well, what is holding you back from becoming everything that you could be? Can you, for example, relate to the social temptation, the social duty temptation? You know, is there something in your family that is really claustrophobic that you're going to need to break through? What are the old parts of yourself that you think need to die? What do you need to shed and leave behind so that you can accomplish what you feel that you need? So you can address all of these questions in one paragraph, but I think it really would be valuable for you to take some time and at least get to know your inner territory about, okay, what is it exactly that you might find in that abyss that you're going to have to contend with if you take this journey of self-exploration. So that concludes this online class, and I have a little homework assignment for you. I have a link up to an article that I wrote about Easter, about the resurrection account in the Gospel of Luke, and I have some reflections on it. So there's going to be two parts of this homework. The first part is I just would like you to take a few notes about what exactly are the details in this resurrection account in Luke, and what are the 3 points that I call attention to? How do I find certain elements in that story significant? And you'll see that the first part of the homework is essential to do the second part of the homework, because once you've done that, then I want you at the next meal that you sit down to, and you're going to see in the story why a meal is important, with your family or your friends or your loved ones, recount to them, first of all, the story in Luke. Just tell them what happens in this resurrection account. And if you'd like, you can also share some of the points of my interpretation if they've resonated with you. And so I just want you to report back to me on what happens. Like, are the people around you receptive? Do they see the point? Are they hostile? Are they oppositional? Whatever happens, I would be very curious just to see how your family or your friends respond to this story. And, if you're lucky, I kind of have a little joking question there. Were you able to see the enlightened Christ part of each other when you broke the bread? And you'll see in the story why that's important. So go ahead and take care of that homework, and I'll see you in the next in-person class.